Welcome back to another deep dive into the wildest stories from Reddit, where today we're exploring family secrets, so explosive they literally tore lives apart. So smash that like button and subscribe because you won't believe where these stories go. Let's jump right in. So this first story comes from a guy we'll call Marcus, and Marcus thought he had the perfect family, loving parents, 2 siblings, a golden retriever named Buddy. The whole suburban dream, but everything changed the day he decided to get one of those ancestry DNA tests for his 30th birthday. His wife thought it would be fun, find out if he had any Italian or Irish heritage, maybe connect with some distant cousins. Harmless stuff, except when the results came back, Marcus discovered something that made his blood run cold. The DNA test showed that his older brother Ryan, the guy he'd shared a bedroom with for 15 years, the guy who taught him how to ride a bike and stood up for him against bullies, wasn't actually his biological brother at all. Now you might think, okay, maybe Ryan was adopted, that's not that crazy, but here's where it gets absolutely insane. Marcus confronted his parents, and after hours of denial and tears, his mother finally broke down and admitted the truth. Ryan wasn't adopted, Marcus was. But wait, it gets worse. His parents had stolen him from a hospital when he was 3 days old. Yeah, you heard that right, stolen. His mother had suffered a miscarriage and completely lost her grip on reality. And when she saw baby Marcus in the hospital nursery where she was recovering, something in her brain just snapped. She convinced Marcus's father to help her take him. They moved 3 states away, changed their names, and raised him as their own. For 30 years, Marcus had no idea he was living with kidnappers. His real parents had spent 3 decades searching for him, never giving up hope. And here's the part that absolutely destroys me. They'd never had another child because they couldn't bear the thought of replacing him. When Marcus finally met his biological parents, his real mother collapsed in his arms, and his real father couldn't even speak. He just sobbed. But now Marcus was stuck in this impossible situation. The people who raised him, who he called Mom and Dad for 30 years, were criminals who stole someone's baby, but they were also the only parents he'd ever known. His biological parents were strangers who loved him desperately, but had missed his entire life. Marcus ended up testifying at his adoptive parents' trial, and watching them get sentenced to 15 years in prison was the hardest thing he'd ever done. Ryan, his not-really brother, stopped speaking to him entirely, blamed him for destroying their family. Last update Marcus posted, he said he was in therapy 3 times a week, trying to build a relationship with his biological parents while grieving the loss of the only family he'd ever known. And he still has. Nightmares about that DNA test, wishing he'd never taken it, wondering if ignorance really would have been bliss. Now that story sets the tone for what we're diving into today, because sometimes the truth doesn't set you free, it absolutely wrecks you. Let's move on to Sarah's story, and Sarah's tale is about a wedding day revelation that literally stopped the ceremony mid-vows. Sarah had been planning her dream wedding for 2 years. Every detail perfect. The venue was this gorgeous vineyard in Sonoma, 300 guests, a 12-tier cake, a dress that cost more than a used car, and she was marrying her college sweetheart Jake, who she'd been with for 7 years. Everything was perfect until the moment the officiant asked if anyone objected to the marriage. Now normally this is just a formality, right? Nobody actually objects, it's just tradition. But Sarah's grandmother, this tiny 80-year-old woman, everyone called Nana Rose, literally stood up and said, "I object." The entire vineyard went silent. Sarah thought it was a joke at first. Maybe Nana Rose was going senile. But then her grandmother walked right up to the altar, looked Jake dead in the eyes and said, "You need to tell her the truth, or I will." Jake's face went white, and Sarah knew immediately that something was horribly wrong. Her grandmother then revealed that Jake had another wife. Not an ex-wife, a current wife. Turned out Jake had gotten married right after high school to his girlfriend, who got pregnant. But when she miscarried 6 months into the pregnancy, their relationship fell apart. Instead of getting divorced though, they just separated, and Jake moved across the country, for college where he met Sarah. He never mentioned being married, never got divorced, just pretended that chapter of his life didn't exist. Nana Rose had discovered this by accident when she was helping Sarah with wedding paperwork and noticed some inconsistencies, so she hired a private investigator who confirmed everything. The wedding obviously didn't happen. Sarah found out later that Jake's legal wife didn't even know he was trying to marry someone else. Sarah sued Jake for the cost of the wedding, $73,000, and won. But the financial hit was nothing compared to the emotional devastation. 7 years of her life gone, all their plans, their apartment, their dog, their shared friend group, everything dissolved in an instant. The worst part, Sarah said, was that everyone at that wedding, all 300 people, witnessed her humiliation. Her cousins still make jokes about it at family gatherings. She can't even look at wedding photos on social media without having a panic attack. Last anyone heard, Sarah moved to Portland, changed careers entirely, and refuses to date anyone seriously. Jake apparently finally got divorced and immediately got engaged to someone else. Like the man learned absolutely nothing. Now here's where things get even darker, because our next story involves a family secret that stayed buried for 40 years until a funeral exposed everything. This story comes from a woman named Patricia, and Patricia was the youngest of 4 siblings in what everyone considered the perfect American family. Her father was a respected doctor, her mother was a teacher, they lived in a beautiful house, went to church every Sunday, the whole deal. When Patricia's mother died of cancer, the family was devastated, but they came together to plan this beautiful funeral, hundreds of people showing up to pay respects. During the reception, after the service, a woman in her 60s approached Patricia and her siblings, introduced herself as Linda, and said she was their sister. At first they thought she was confused. Maybe grief does strange things to people at funerals, but Linda pulled out documents, photos, letters, everything. Turned out Patricia's father had an entire secret family in another city. He'd been living a double life for over 40 years. Linda was his daughter from his first marriage, a marriage he'd never actually ended legally before marrying Patricia's mother. So technically, Patricia's parents' marriage was never legal, which meant Patricia and her siblings were all illegitimate in the eyes of the law. But it gets so much worse. Patricia's father had 3 other children with his first wife, and he'd been travelling back and forth between families for decades, telling each family he was away on business or medical conferences. The man was living in 2 houses, celebrating 2 sets of birthdays, attending 2 different churches, maintaining 2 completely separate lives. When Patricia confronted her father at the funeral, in front of everyone, he just broke down and admitted everything. Said he'd fallen in love with Patricia's mother, but couldn't bring himself to leave his first family, so he just decided to have both. The inheritance battle that followed was absolutely vicious. Linda and her siblings sued for their share of the estate, which was substantial because Patricia's father had been a successful surgeon. The legal fees alone cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Patricia's family lost the house they grew up in, most of their inheritance, and worst of all, their memories of their childhood were now tainted with lies. Every family vacation, every holiday, every moment they thought was special, their father had been doing the same things with another family. Patricia said the betrayal was so deep that she and 2 of her siblings changed their last names and cut off all contact with their father before he died. He spent his last years alone in a nursing home, neither family willing to visit him. The comment section on Patricia's post was full of people sharing similar stories. Apparently, secret second families are way more common than anyone wants to admit. Moving on to another absolutely wild story. This one involves a high school reunion that revealed a conspiracy that lasted 25 years. This comes from a guy named David, and David was never popular in high school. He was overweight, had bad acne, was terrible at sports, basically an easy target. One girl in particular, Jessica, made his life absolutely miserable. She'd trip him in the hallways, spread rumours about him, mock him in front of everyone. Classic mean girl stuff. David's senior year was so bad that he actually switched schools for the last semester just to escape the bullying. Fast forward 25 years, David had a major glow-up, lost the weight, became a successful software engineer, married a beautiful woman, had 2 great kids, living his best life. When his high school reunion invitation came, he almost didn't go, but his wife convinced him it would be good closure. At the reunion, David was shocked to see that Jessica had not aged well. Life had been rough on her. Multiple divorces, struggled with addiction, working a job she hated. She approached David, clearly didn't recognize him at first, and when he introduced himself, she burst into tears and started apologizing profusely. She begged him to forgive her, said she'd been in therapy for years dealing with guilt over how she treated people in high school. David, being a good person, told her it was okay, water under the bridge. They were different people now. But then another former classmate, Tom, who'd had a few too many drinks, came over and made a comment that changed everything. Tom said something like, "Remember when we all got paid to mess with David? Man, that was messed up." David was confused, asked what Tom meant, and that's when the whole thing unraveled. Turned out David's own father had paid Jessica and several other popular kids to bully him. Yeah, his own father. David's dad was this old-school tough guy who thought his son was too soft, too sensitive, not masculine enough. So he literally hired teenagers to bully his own son, thinking it would toughen him up. He'd been paying Jessica $50 a week to make David's life hell. Several other kids had been in on it too, smaller amounts, but it was a coordinated effort, funded by David's own father. David left the reunion immediately, drove straight to his parents' house, and confronted his father at midnight. His dad didn't even deny it, just said he'd been trying to make David stronger, that the world was cruel and he needed to learn to handle it. David cut off all contact with his father that night. His mother had to choose between her husband and her son, and she chose her husband, so David lost both parents. The really messed up part is that David's father died 2 years later and left David a substantial inheritance with a note that said, "I'm proud of the man you became." David donated every penny to anti-bullying charities. He said keeping that money would feel like validating what his father did. Jessica, meanwhile, has tried to reach out multiple times to apologise more fully, but David wants nothing to do with her. Says that even though she was just a teenager being paid, she still made the choice to be cruel, and he can't forgive that. Now let's talk about Emily's story, which involves a baby that wasn't supposed to exist. Emily and her husband Mark had been trying to have a baby for 6 years. They'd done IVF 3 times, spent over $100,000, suffered through 4 miscarriages, and finally decided to adopt. The adoption process took 2 years, but finally they brought home a beautiful baby girl they named Sophie. Life was perfect for about 3 years until Emily got pregnant naturally, which their doctors had said was basically impossible. They were shocked but thrilled. But when Emily went in for her 20-week ultrasound, the technician got very quiet and called in the doctor. That's when they discovered that Emily was pregnant with twins, which was surprising enough, but the genetic testing revealed something impossible. One of the twins had Mark's DNA, but the other twin had DNA from a completely different father. The doctor explained this extremely rare phenomenon called heteropaternal superfecundation, which basically means Emily had released 2 eggs and they'd been fertilised by 2 different men within a short time frame. Emily swore she hadn't cheated on Mark, and he believed her because they'd been together constantly during the time of conception. After weeks of investigation and more DNA testing, they discovered the horrifying truth. Emily's brother-in-law, Mark's younger brother Tyler, had assaulted Emily while she was passed out drunk at a family party. Emily had no memory of it because she'd been drugged. Tyler had apparently been attracted to Emily for years and saw an opportunity when everyone else had gone to bed. The DNA evidence was irrefutable. One of the babies was Tyler's. The family was torn apart. Mark wanted to press charges, but his parents begged him not to, saying it would destroy the family. Emily was traumatized all over again, not just by the assault, but by the fact that she was carrying her attacker's baby. She considered terminating that specific twin, which is medically possible, but extremely risky, or giving just that baby up for adoption, but ultimately decided she couldn't separate twins who'd shared a womb. Tyler went to prison for 8 years after Emily and Mark decided to press charges, despite family pressure. Mark's parents disowned both of them for pursuing prosecution. When the twins were born, one looked exactly like Mark, and the other looked nothing like either parent, clearly resembling Tyler. Emily and Mark are raising both twins as their own, but they've been in intense therapy. They plan to tell the kids the truth when they're old enough to understand, but they're dreading that conversation. The twin who is Tyler's biological son, they named him Charlie, will someday have to learn that his biological father is a rapist serving time in prison. Emily posts updates occasionally, and she says the hardest part is when people comment on how the twins don't look alike, or ask if they're really twins, because she has to relive the trauma every time someone brings it up. She's also terrified that Tyler will try to claim parental rights when he gets out of prison. Now we need to talk about Robert's story, which involves a restaurant, a chance encounter, and a revelation about his wife that destroyed his entire reality. Robert had been married to his wife Amanda for 12 years. They had 3 kids, a nice house, seemed happy. One night Robert was out with colleagues for a business dinner at an upscale restaurant when he saw Amanda walk in with another man. His first thought was maybe it's a work thing, but then he watched this man pull out her chair, touch her hand, lean in, and kiss her. Robert's heart stopped. He excused himself from his table, walked over, and was about to confront them when he heard the man call Amanda by a different name, Jennifer. Robert stood there confused, and when Amanda finally looked up and saw him, the colour drained from her face. She tried to play it off, stammered something about a misunderstanding, but the other man was equally confused, asking Jennifer who this person was. That's when Robert realised his wife had an entire other life. Turned out Amanda, whose real name was Jennifer Schultz, was married to another man and had been for 15 years, 3 years longer than she'd been married to Robert. She had another house in a different suburb, stepchildren from this other marriage, a whole separate existence. Jennifer/Amanda had been commuting between 2 lives for over a decade. She told Robert she had a demanding job that required frequent overnight trips, and she told her first husband the same thing. She'd essentially been living as 2 different people, with 2 different families, neither knowing about the other. When everything came out, it was discovered that Amanda had actually been doing this with 3 different men simultaneously. Robert was husband number 2, and there was a 3rd guy named Eric who she'd married 4 years ago. She was legally married to her first husband, which meant her marriages to Robert and Eric were invalid, but she'd still gone through ceremonies, worn wedding dresses, said vows, maintained these relationships. The investigation into her life revealed that she'd grown up in foster care, had severe attachment issues, and had basically been running from her trauma by creating these elaborate fantasy lives. She'd keep each man separate, never letting worlds collide, using burner phones and separate bank accounts. When confronted, Amanda had a complete mental breakdown and was institutionalized. Robert had to explain to his 3 children that their mother had other families and that she might go to prison for fraud and bigamy. The kids were devastated, especially when they found out they had step-siblings they'd never met. Robert said the worst part was going through photo albums and realising that on days they'd taken family pictures, Amanda would sometimes leave and go take family pictures with her other family. She'd been posting to 2 different Facebook accounts, living 2 completely different personas. Robert's trying to rebuild his life, but he says he can't trust anyone anymore, and he has panic attacks when his current girlfriend doesn't answer her phone. Let's shift gears to Michael's story, which involves the inheritance, a will reading, and a family secret that had been kept for 60 years. Michael's grandfather was a wealthy businessman who'd built a small empire from nothing, and when he died at 91, the family gathered for the will reading, expecting a straightforward distribution of assets. Instead, the lawyer started by saying that Michael's grandfather had written a letter to be read aloud to everyone. The letter began with an apology, and then Michael's grandfather confessed to something that made everyone's blood run cold. Back in the 1960s, Michael's grandfather and his best friend had started a business together, 50-50 partners. The business struggled for years but eventually became successful. However, when they were on the verge of a major breakthrough deal, Michael's grandfather had sabotaged his partner, made it look like the partner had embezzled money and forced him out of the company. The partner's reputation was destroyed, he lost everything, and he ended up taking his own life a year later. Michael's grandfather had stolen the entire company and built his fortune on a lie and his partner's death. The letter went on to reveal that the partner had a wife and 2 children who'd been left destitute. Michael's grandfather had watched this family struggle for decades and never said a word. Now, in his will, he was leaving half of his entire estate, worth about $40 million, to the descendants of the man he'd wronged. The family was in shock. Michael's father and uncles started arguing immediately, saying they weren't responsible for what their father had done, that this money was rightfully theirs. But the will was ironclad. The lawyer had made sure of it. The partner's family was contacted, and they had no idea any of this had happened. The partner's daughter, now in her 70s, had spent her entire life believing her father was a thief who'd abandoned them. Learning the truth was both a relief and a tragedy. She got to know that her father hadn't betrayed them, but she also had to accept that someone had deliberately destroyed him. The legal battle lasted 3 years, with Michael's family fighting tooth and nail to keep the money. They argued that the statute of limitations had passed, that there was no proof beyond the confession, everything they could think of. But ultimately, the will stood, and half the estate went to the partner's descendants. Michael said his family hasn't been the same since. Everyone's divided, some think. Grandfather did the right thing by confessing and making amends. Others think he was a coward who should have made things right while he was alive, instead of dumping this burden on his descendants. Michael personally thinks his grandfather's guilt finally caught up with him, but he took the coward's way out by only confessing after death when he wouldn't have to face consequences. Michael also found out that his grandfather had attempted to reach out to the partner's family several times over the years, but always chickened out, and that guilt had apparently eaten him alive for 6 decades. Now here's a story that's going to make you question everything about modern dating and technology. This comes from a woman named Rachel, and Rachel had been dating her boyfriend Chris for about 8 months. Things were getting serious, meeting families, talking about moving in together, the whole 9 yards. One day Rachel was using Chris's laptop because hers was dead, and she needed to print something for work. She opened his documents folder looking for a file he'd sent her, and she accidentally clicked on a folder labelled Project. Inside were hundreds of files, spreadsheets, documents, photos, all meticulously organised. Rachel opened one of the Excel files and discovered something that made her stomach drop. Chris had been keeping detailed spreadsheets on every woman he'd dated for the past 7 years. We're talking every date logged, every conversation summarised, every gift documented with price and reaction. He had rating systems for physical appearance, personality traits, bedroom compatibility, family wealth, career prospects, everything. Rachel found her own file, and seeing herself reduced to numerical ratings and clinical observations was horrifying. He'd written things like, "Rachel insecure about weight, can use this for control, and family has money, potential long-term investment." There were files on over 30 women, some he'd dated for years, some just a few dates. He'd documented their vulnerabilities, their secrets, their fears, everything they'd shared in confidence. It was like he'd been running psychological experiments on them. But it got darker. Chris had a folder within the folder labelled strategies, and these were basically manipulation techniques he'd developed. Things like how to make someone feel guilty so they'd sleep with you, how to isolate someone from their friends, how to make someone financially dependent. It was sociopathic. Rachel photographed everything on her phone, then carefully closed all the files and didn't say anything to Chris. Instead, she went to the police, showed them what she'd found, and asked if any of this was illegal. While nothing was technically illegal, just deeply disturbing, the detective suggested she might want to warn the other women. Rachel spent the next week tracking down as many of the women from Chris's files as she could, and she created a private Facebook group where she shared what she'd found. The response was overwhelming. Dozens of women came forward saying Chris had emotionally abused them, manipulated them, some said worse. Several women reported that Chris had filmed them during intimate moments without consent, which is illegal. Armed with these testimonies, multiple women pressed charges. Chris was arrested and charged with several counts of illegal recording and voyeurism. During the investigation, police found that Chris had been selling some of the intimate videos online, making money off these women's most private moments. He ended up pleading guilty to avoid trial and got 6 years in prison. But the trauma he left behind affected dozens of women, some who'd spent years in therapy thinking they were the problem, that they were crazy or too sensitive. Finding out they'd been systematically manipulated and studied like lab rats was devastating. Rachel said she still has nightmares about what would have happened if she hadn't found those files, if she'd moved in with him like they'd planned, if she'd married him. She wonders how long he would have continued the charade and what his endgame was. Several of the women from the Facebook group still meet regularly as a support system, and they've started advocating for laws around emotional abuse and manipulation. Now let's talk about Jennifer's story, which starts with a DNA test for medical purposes and ends with discovering she's part of a fertility fraud scandal that affected hundreds of families. Jennifer had been having some unexplained health issues, and her doctor recommended genetic testing to rule out hereditary conditions. The results came back showing she had markers for a genetic condition that neither of her parents had, which was odd. Her doctor suggested her parents get tested too, just to be thorough. That's when they discovered that Jennifer's father wasn't her biological father. Jennifer's parents had used a fertility clinic in the early 90s because her father had a low sperm count. They'd used an anonymous sperm donor, which they'd always planned to tell Jennifer about eventually, but never got around to it. The fertility clinic had provided detailed information about the donor, medical history, education, physical characteristics, all anonymous of course, but when Jennifer decided to find out who her biological father was, she used one of those DNA matching services, and that's when everything fell apart. Jennifer matched with not one, not two, but 37 half-siblings, all from the same sperm donor, all born within a 5-year period, all in the same geographic area. This was already concerning because sperm donors are supposed to be limited in how many children they can father to prevent accidental incest in future generations. But then Jennifer started talking to her half-siblings, comparing notes, and they realised something horrifying. The physical descriptions they'd all been given about their donor, tall, blonde, athletic, doctorate in biochemistry, didn't match any of them. Jennifer and most of her half-siblings had dark hair, dark eyes, were short and stocky. When several of them pooled money to hire a private investigator, they discovered that their biological father wasn't an anonymous donor at all. It was Dr. Richard Morrison, the fertility doctor who'd run the clinic. Dr. Morrison had been using his own sperm instead of the donor's sperm, impregnating his patients with his own genetic material without their knowledge or consent. This had been going on for over a decade, and Dr. Morrison had fathered at least 61 children that they knew of, possibly more. The scandal exploded. Turns out this wasn't an isolated case. Fertility fraud is shockingly common. Jennifer found out she had dozens of half-siblings, many living in the same city. Some had even gone to the same schools without knowing they were related. Two of Jennifer's half-siblings had actually dated in college, nearly married, had no idea they were biological siblings. When confronted, Dr. Morrison claimed he'd been doing these women a favour, giving them the best possible genetic material. He genuinely seemed to think he'd done nothing wrong. The legal battle was complex because at the time he'd done this, there were no specific laws against fertility fraud in that state. He was eventually convicted of fraud and assault, sentenced to only 2 years in prison, which seemed insultingly light given the magnitude of what he'd done. Jennifer and her half-siblings have tried to build relationships, but it's complicated. They're strangers who share DNA, connected by a violation of their parents. Jennifer's relationship with her father, the man who raised her, became strained because he felt like he'd been robbed of having a biological child. Her mother was traumatized all over again, realizing she'd been violated during one of the most vulnerable moments of her life. Jennifer said the worst part is knowing that Dr. Morrison stole her parents' choice about who would be her biological father, and that she exists because of a man's ego and God complex. She struggles with her identity, wondering which parts of her personality come from this narcissistic doctor, which of her traits are his. The support group for Dr. Morrison's biological children meets monthly, and they're still discovering new siblings. It's like the number keeps growing. Some of his children want nothing to do with him. Others have tried to build a relationship, trying to separate the person from the crime. But Jennifer wants him to suffer. She's been very vocal about wanting harsher penalties for fertility fraud. Let me tell you about Kevin's story now, which involves a storage unit, a deceased parent, and a discovery that revealed his entire childhood was a lie. Kevin's mother passed away from cancer, and Kevin was tasked with cleaning out her apartment and her storage unit. The apartment was straightforward: furniture, clothes, photo albums, normal stuff. But the storage unit was packed with boxes Kevin had never seen before. His mother had never mentioned having a storage unit, and Kevin had been paying for it automatically from her account without realizing what it was for. When Kevin started going through the boxes, he found documents that didn't make sense. Birth certificates with different names, passports, IDs, all with his mother's photo but different identities. There were newspaper clippings about missing children from the 70s and 80s, maps with locations marked, journals filled with coded entries. Kevin thought maybe his mother had been a spy or something. It seemed that dramatic. Then he found a box that contained his own baby photos. But the weird thing was there were 2 sets of baby photos, 2 different babies, both labelled with his name and birth date. That's when Kevin started to suspect something terrible. He took everything to the police, and they launched an investigation. What they uncovered was that Kevin's mother had kidnapped him when he was 18 months old from a shopping mall in Ohio. She'd taken him across state lines, changed both their identities, and had been on the run for 36 years. Kevin's real name was Matthew Parker, and his biological parents had never stopped looking for him. They'd aged out of getting media attention. The case went cold, but they'd never given up hope. The police contacted Kevin's biological parents, who were now in their 60s, and arranged a meeting. Kevin said walking into that room and seeing these strangers, who were technically his parents, was surreal. They looked at him like he was a ghost. His biological mother kept touching his face, crying, saying she'd memorized his baby face and had tried to imagine what he'd look like grown up. Kevin's biological father just kept saying, "We knew you were alive. We always knew." But here's where it gets complicated. Kevin had no memory of these people. He'd been so young when he was taken. The woman who'd raised him, who he'd called Mum his whole life, was a kidnapper. But she'd also been a loving mother who'd taken care of him, helped him with homework, supported his dreams, been there for every important moment. Kevin was angry that she'd stolen him, stolen his identity, stolen his biological parents' chance to raise him. But he also grieved her death and missed her. His biological parents wanted him to move back to Ohio to make up for lost time, but Kevin had a life where he was, a job, friends, a girlfriend. They were hurt that he wasn't immediately jumping into their arms, but Kevin felt like he was being asked to abandon his life for people he didn't know. The media got wind of the story, and it became a circus. Everyone had opinions about what Kevin should do, how he should feel. Kevin ended up needing serious therapy to process everything. He learned that he had 3 younger siblings. His biological parents had more children after he was taken, so he had family he'd never known existed. His girlfriend left him because the stress was too much. She couldn't handle the media attention and the complicated family dynamics. Kevin's biological parents sued his mother's estate for emotional distress. Even though she was dead, they wanted justice or acknowledgement or something. Kevin was caught in the middle, legally the executor of his kidnapper mother's estate, emotionally loyal to the woman who raised him, but also recognizing the incredible pain his biological parents had endured. Last update, Kevin had decided to split his time between his old life and getting to know his biological family, but he said it feels like living in 2 worlds and belonging to neither. He resents his mother for putting him in this position, but he can't bring himself to completely condemn her because his memories of his childhood are genuinely happy. One of the boxes in the storage unit contained a letter his mother had written to him to be opened after her death, and in it she apologised but also tried to explain that she'd taken him because she'd lost her own son to SIDS and she'd been mentally broken. And when she saw Kevin alone in that stroller, something in her snapped. She said she knew it was wrong, but she'd given him a good life, and she hoped he could forgive her someday. Kevin said he doesn't know if he can forgive her, but he understands she was a broken person who did a terrible thing, and somehow that makes it harder, not easier. Now we need to talk about the story of Daniel and his discovery about his friend group that changed everything. Daniel had the same core friend group since middle school, 6 guys who'd been through everything together. They were like brothers. They had a group chat, hung out multiple times a week, went on annual trips together, the works. Daniel had been dating his girlfriend Laura for 3 years, and she was integrated into the friend group. Everyone loved her. One night, Daniel was at his buddy Jason's place for poker night, and he realised he'd left his phone in Jason's car. He borrowed Jason's phone to check if Laura had texted him. They were supposed to meet up later. When he opened the Messages app, he saw the group chat, but there was a second group chat with the same members, same 6 guys, but Laura was excluded and the name was different. Daniel's stomach dropped. He opened it and saw messages that made him feel sick. The guys had been running a bet for 2 years on how long Daniel and Laura's relationship would last, with money in a pool. But it was worse than just a bet. They'd been actively sabotaging the relationship. Jason had told Laura that Daniel had cheated on her when he hadn't. Mike had shown Laura fake text messages to make her jealous. Chris had tried to kiss Laura to test if she'd cheat on Daniel. They'd been manufacturing drama and problems in the relationship for entertainment and money. The messages showed them laughing about fights Daniel and Laura had, fights they'd caused, discussing strategies to push them closer to breaking up. Daniel took screenshots of everything, forwarded them to his own phone, then confronted all of them immediately. At first they tried to deny it, then minimize it, saying it was just stupid guy stuff, just joking around. But Daniel showed them the receipts, hundreds of messages showing calculated manipulation. He called Laura, told her everything, showed her the proof. She was devastated. These were people she'd considered friends. Daniel and Laura ended up staying together. Their relationship actually got stronger because they realised the problems they'd been having weren't organic. They'd been manufactured. But Daniel cut off all 5 guys completely, and they'd been his best friends for over 15 years. The fallout was massive. Their social circle was completely fractured. People had to choose sides. Mutual friends didn't believe it at first until Daniel showed them the screenshots. Some people thought Daniel was overreacting, that guys do dumb stuff, and he should forgive them. But Daniel said it wasn't just dumb stuff. It was systematic psychological manipulation of both him and Laura for entertainment. What made it worse was finding out how long it had been going on. 2 years of manufactured problems. 2 years of his friends actively trying to ruin his happiness. Jason eventually sent a long apology text, admitting it had started as a stupid bet, but had gotten out of control, and he felt terrible. Daniel didn't respond. Last anyone knew, Jason, Mike, and Chris were still friends with each other, but 2 of the guys from the original group had sided with Daniel and cut them off too. Daniel said the betrayal felt worse than if Laura had actually cheated on him, because these were people he'd trusted implicitly, people he would have done anything for, and they'd been treating his life like a game. He still has trust issues, struggles to make new friends because he's paranoid. They have ulterior motives. Laura and Daniel ended up getting engaged, partly as a middle finger to the guys who bet they wouldn't last, and Daniel said his wedding will be small because he realised he'd rather have 2 real friends than 50 fake ones. Moving on to another absolutely devastating story. This one comes from a woman named Angela, and it involves a surprise party that revealed an affair that had been going on for 7 years. Angela decided to throw her husband, Tom, a surprise 40th birthday party. His birthday was on a Saturday, so she planned the party for that evening, invited all his friends, family, co-workers, rented out a restaurant's private room, the whole deal. Tom thought they were just going to have a quiet dinner at home. Angela spent weeks planning, coordinating with Tom's secretary to make sure he didn't have any work conflicts, getting everyone's schedules to align. The day of the party, Angela sent Tom on a fake errand to get him out of the house, so she could set everything up. She was at the restaurant early, greeting guests as they arrived, everyone excited to surprise Tom. Tom's secretary had assured Angela that Tom would arrive at 7 sharp. Angela had checked in with her that morning. Everything was set. 7 o'clock came and Tom didn't show up. Angela wasn't worried yet, maybe traffic. 7:15, 7:30, Angela tried calling Tom, straight to voicemail. By 7:45, people were getting restless, asking what was going on. Angela called Tom's secretary, who said Tom had left the office at 6:30 as planned. Angela was starting to panic, thinking maybe Tom had been in an accident. She was about to call hospitals when Tom's best friend Mark pulled her aside and said they needed to talk privately. Mark's face was serious, and Angela knew immediately something was very wrong. Mark took Angela outside and told her he was sorry, but he'd just gotten a text from another friend saying they'd seen Tom at a hotel across town with a woman, and they were checking into a room together. Angela felt like the ground disappeared beneath her feet. Mark offered to drive her to the hotel, and in a daze she agreed, leaving the party full of confused guests. When they got to the hotel, Angela marched up to the front desk and demanded to know if Tom Reynolds had checked in. The desk clerk wouldn't give her the room number, but Angela's face must have shown she was about to lose it, because another employee quietly told her room 412. Angela took the elevator up, Mark following behind, and knocked on the door. Tom answered in a hotel robe, his face going white when he saw Angela. Behind him, Angela could see a woman scrambling to get dressed. But here's the truly devastating part. The woman was Tom's secretary, Karen, the same woman who'd helped Angela plan the surprise party, who'd been texting Angela all day with updates, who Angela had trusted completely. Angela just stood there in shock, while Tom tried to stammer out explanations, and then Karen, having somewhat pulled herself together, said something that made everything so much worse. She said, "I'm sorry, Angela, but Tom and I are in love. We have been for 7 years, and we're getting married." 7 years. Angela had been married to Tom for 12 years total, which meant he'd been cheating on her for more than half their marriage. Karen had been working as Tom's secretary for 8 years, which meant the affair started within a year of her being hired. Angela thought about all the late nights Tom had blamed on work, all the business trips, all the times Karen had called the house or texted Tom. Completely innocent in Angela's eyes because she was just his secretary. The affair had been happening right under Angela's nose the entire time. Angela found her voice and asked if Karen knew about the party, and Karen admitted she did. Said she'd helped Angela plan it as a cover, so she and Tom could have the evening together at the hotel. The cruelty of that. Helping Angela plan a party for the man they were both involved with, using it as an alibi for their affair, was beyond comprehension. Angela said she felt like she'd been living in a simulation, like her entire marriage had been a lie. She went back to the restaurant and had to tell a room full of people that there would be no party, no birthday celebration, that Tom wouldn't be coming. Some people figured out what happened, others were confused, but Angela's humiliation was complete. The divorce was nasty. Angela made sure everyone knew exactly what had happened, how long the affair had been going on, how Karen had helped plan the party while sleeping with Tom. Tom's family was horrified. His mother stopped speaking to him. Tom and Karen did get married, about 6 months after the divorce was finalised, and Angela took some small satisfaction when she heard through mutual friends that Karen was paranoid. Tom would cheat on her the same way he'd cheated on Angela, that she constantly checked his phone and questioned his whereabouts, living in the same fear and insecurity she'd helped create for Angela. Angela said the hardest part was realising how many memories were tainted, how many times she'd trusted Tom when he was lying, how many times she'd been kind to Karen, confided in her even, while Karen was betraying her. She had to get tested for STDs because she had no idea if Tom had been safe or if there had been others besides Karen. She had to tell their 2 children why Daddy moved out, why Mommy cried all the time, trying to protect them from the worst details, while being honest that Daddy had made bad choices. Angela's now remarried to a wonderful man who's never given her reason to doubt him, but she said she still has moments of paranoia, still has nightmares about that hotel room, still feels physically sick when she sees women who look like Karen. She said the surprise party ruined surprise parties for her forever. She can't even attend them without getting anxious. Let's move on to Carl's story, which involves a class reunion and the discovery that his entire childhood friendship was built on a paid arrangement. Carl had been best friends with a kid named Brandon from 2nd grade through high school. They were inseparable, sleepovers every weekend, sat together at lunch, played on the same sports teams, everything. After high school, they drifted apart naturally, went to different colleges, started different careers, but Carl always remembered Brandon fondly as his childhood best friend. When their 20-year high school reunion came around, Carl was excited to see Brandon again, catch up, reminisce about old times. They met at the reunion and hugged, started talking about old memories, and everything seemed great until Carl mentioned something about how lucky they were that their parents became friends too, since that made all their hangouts so easy to arrange. Brandon got this weird look on his face and said, "Actually, I need to tell you something. It's been bothering me for years." Brandon then explained that their friendship hadn't been natural or organic at all. Carl's parents had paid Brandon's parents to have Brandon be Carl's friend. Carl had struggled socially in early elementary school, had been bullied, didn't fit in, and his parents were worried about him. So they approached Brandon's family, who was struggling financially, and offered them money if Brandon would befriend Carl. They paid Brandon's parents $500 a month for 11 years, from 2nd grade through high school graduation. Every sleepover, every birthday party invitation, every time Brandon had stood up for Carl or included him, it had been because his parents were being paid. Brandon said his parents had made him do it at first and he'd resented Carl for years, but eventually they actually did become real friends. Or at least Brandon thought so, but the foundation of their entire friendship had been a financial transaction. Carl was devastated. He felt like his entire childhood had been a lie, like he'd never had a real friend at all. He confronted his parents, who admitted it was true, but said they didn't regret it, that Carl had needed help, and they'd done what they thought was best. They said Brandon had been good for Carl, had helped him come out of his shell, and that the friendship had seemed real regardless of how it started. But Carl couldn't get past the deception, the fact that Brandon had been paid to tolerate him, that every fond memory was built on manipulation. Brandon tried to explain that the friendship had become genuine, that after the first year or two he wasn't hanging out with Carl because of the money, he actually liked him. But Carl couldn't believe that, couldn't separate the authentic moments from the performance. Carl cut off contact with his parents for 2 years, said he couldn't trust anything they'd ever told him about his childhood, who his real friends were, whether people had actually liked him. He went through his entire high school experience in his memory, wondering if other friendships had been paid for too, if his girlfriend had been bribed to date him, if everything had been manufactured. His parents swore Brandon was the only one, but Carl didn't believe them. He eventually went to therapy and worked through some of his feelings, came to understand that his parents had been trying to help, even if their method was questionable. He reconciled with his parents, but said the relationship would never be the same. There was always this underlying resentment. As for Brandon, Carl couldn't maintain the friendship, said that even if parts of it had been real, the knowledge that it started as a transaction poisoned everything. Brandon apparently felt terrible, had wanted to tell Carl for years but never found the right time, and he understood why Carl couldn't continue the friendship. Carl said the worst part was that he still didn't know if he was fundamentally unlikable, if without his parents' intervention he would have remained alone and friendless, if his social skills were actually that bad. His confidence was shattered, and even in his adult friendships he wondered if people were only tolerating him, if there was something wrong with him that everyone could see, except him. Now here's a story that involves social media, a viral post, and a family secret that should have stayed buried. This comes from a woman named Melissa, and Melissa was adopted as a baby, always knew she was adopted, had wonderful adoptive parents who'd been open about it. When Melissa turned 30, she decided she wanted to find her biological mother, not because she wasn't grateful for her adoptive parents, but just out of curiosity about her medical history and heritage. She did a DNA test and got a match with her biological mother, a woman named Diane who was 52. Melissa reached out through the DNA site's messaging system, and Diane responded warmly, said she'd always hoped Melissa would find her, that giving her up for adoption had been the hardest decision of her life. They started exchanging messages, then phone calls, and eventually decided to meet in person. The meeting went well. Diane explained she'd gotten pregnant at 22 from a brief relationship, wasn't ready to be a mother, made the difficult choice to give Melissa up for adoption so she could have a better life. Melissa appreciated the honesty, and they started building a relationship. Diane introduced Melissa to her half-siblings. Diane had gotten married a few years after Melissa was born, and had 3 other children who were excited to meet their big sister. Everything seemed perfect. Melissa felt like she'd gained this whole new family, while still maintaining her relationship with her adoptive parents. Then Melissa made a Facebook post about her reunion with her biological mother, posted a photo of them together, wrote this heartfelt caption about finding her roots and being grateful for Diane's sacrifice. The post went viral. Thousands of shares, people commenting about how beautiful the story was. News outlets even picked it up as a feel-good human interest story. But then, Melissa started getting weird messages from people she didn't know. People saying she needed to ask Diane about what really happened, that Diane was lying to her. Melissa ignored them at first, thinking they were just internet trolls, but the messages kept coming, all saying similar things. Finally, someone sent Melissa a link to a true crime forum discussing Diane's case. Melissa clicked on it and discovered that her biological mother hadn't given her up for adoption willingly at all. Diane had been arrested when Melissa was 3 days old for attempting to smother her in the hospital. Diane had been suffering from severe postpartum psychosis, had become convinced that Melissa was evil or possessed, and had tried to kill her. A nurse had walked in during the attempt and stopped her. Melissa had survived unharmed physically, but Diane was arrested and hospitalized in a psychiatric facility. The state had taken custody of Melissa and put her up for adoption. All of this was public record, but Melissa had never thought to search for her birth name in connection with crime records. Diane had served 3 years in a psychiatric prison, been released, gotten treatment, gone on to live a normal life and have more children, but she'd never told Melissa the truth about what happened. Melissa confronted Diane, who broke down and admitted everything, said she'd been planning to tell Melissa eventually, but wanted to build a relationship first, was afraid Melissa would reject her if she knew the truth from the start. Diane explained that the postpartum psychosis had been a medical emergency. She hadn't been in her right mind. She'd gotten treatment and had been fine with her subsequent pregnancies, but Melissa couldn't get past the fact that this woman had tried to kill her, that her origin story wasn't a noble sacrifice, but a criminal act, that she'd been lied to for months. Melissa's half-siblings were also in shock. They'd never been told about what their mother had done. The family completely fractured. Melissa's half-siblings took sides, some supporting Diane, saying she'd been mentally ill and it wasn't her fault. Others horrified that their mother had kept this secret. The viral Facebook post turned into a nightmare. The comments section filled with people debating mental illness, postpartum psychosis, whether Diane should have disclosed this up front, whether Melissa was overreacting. Melissa ended up deleting all her social media because the attention was too much. She cut off contact with Diane and her biological family, said she couldn't trust any of them, that the lie of omission was too big. Melissa's adoptive parents felt vindicated in a way. They'd always been worried about Melissa searching for her biological family, afraid she'd get hurt, but they'd supported her anyway. Melissa said she wished she'd never done the DNA test, never found Diane, never opened this Pandora's box, the mental image of her biological mother trying to smother her as an infant haunted her dreams. She understood intellectually that postpartum psychosis was a real medical condition, that Diane hadn't been in control of her actions, but emotionally, she couldn't get past it. The worst part was that some people online called Melissa heartless for cutting off Diane, said she should forgive someone who was mentally ill, that Diane had served her time and reformed her life. But Melissa said those people didn't have to live with the knowledge that the person who gave them life also tried to take it away. Now let's talk about Greg's story, which involves a bachelor party, a hired entertainer, and a revelation that destroyed 2 families. Greg was getting married to his fiancée Hannah, and his best man threw him a bachelor party in Vegas. Standard stuff: gambling, drinking, clubs. Greg's friends hired a stripper for the hotel suite, which Greg wasn't thrilled about because Hannah had specifically asked him not to have strippers at his bachelor party, but he went along with it to not be a buzzkill. The stripper arrived and started her performance, and about 5 minutes in, Greg recognized her. It was his fiancée's younger sister, Emma. Emma was supposed to be in college across the country. Hannah had mentioned she was struggling financially, but Hannah had been sending her money to help with tuition and rent. But here was Emma, stripping at Greg's bachelor party in Las Vegas, clearly not in college, clearly working as an exotic dancer. The room went silent when Emma and Greg recognized each other. Emma grabbed her clothes and ran out. Greg chased after her into the hallway, both of them freaking out. Emma begged Greg not to tell Hannah, said she'd dropped out of college 6 months ago, had gotten into debt, started dancing to pay it off, and was too ashamed to tell her family. She'd been lying to Hannah about school, taking the money Hannah sent and using it for living expenses while she worked at various clubs. Greg said he had to tell Hannah this was too big a secret to keep, but Emma threatened that if he told Hannah, she'd tell Hannah that Greg had hired her specifically, that he'd known she was a stripper and had requested her for the party, that the whole thing was his idea. It would be her word against his. Greg was trapped. If he told the truth, Emma would lie and make him look like a predator who deliberately hired his fiancée's sister as a stripper. If he didn't tell Hannah, he'd be keeping a massive secret about her sister. Greg spent the rest of the bachelor party completely miserable, couldn't enjoy anything, his friends asking what was wrong. He decided he had to tell Hannah regardless of Emma's threat, because starting a marriage with a lie like this felt wrong. When Greg got back from Vegas, he sat Hannah down and told her everything, showed her a receipt from his best man for the entertainment to prove he hadn't hired Emma, had texts from his friends backing up his story. Hannah was devastated, not at Greg, but at Emma's betrayal and deception. She called Emma immediately, and Emma initially stuck to her threat, claimed Greg had hired her specifically, but when Hannah pointed out the timeline and receipts didn't match Emma's story, Emma broke down and admitted the truth. Hannah was crushed. She'd been sacrificing, living frugally, and sending Emma hundreds of dollars a month for college, and Emma had been lying the whole time. Emma wasn't even just dancing at clubs. She'd been working as an escort, something she finally admitted when everything came out. Hannah's parents got involved. There were massive family fights. Emma was cut off financially and basically disowned. Hannah and Greg's wedding went forward, but the whole thing was overshadowed by the drama. Emma wasn't invited. Half the family was fighting about whether they were being too hard on Emma. Hannah spiraled into depression, feeling like she'd failed as a big sister, wondering what she'd done wrong that Emma couldn't come to her for help. Greg felt guilty, even though he'd done nothing wrong, felt like he'd been the catalyst for destroying Hannah's family. Emma apparently hit rock bottom after being cut off, got into drugs for a while, but eventually got clean and found a legitimate job. She tried to reconcile with Hannah years later, sent a long apology letter taking full responsibility, but Hannah wasn't ready to forgive. Greg and Hannah are still married, but Hannah's relationship with her family never fully recovered. Holidays are tense. Certain people still think Hannah was too harsh on Emma. Greg said he sometimes wishes he'd never recognised Emma, had just let her finish and leave, but he knows that would have been the wrong choice, that secrets like that always come out eventually. Now here's a story that's going to make you think twice about home DNA tests. This comes from a man named Peter, and it involves discovering that his mother had been swapping babies at the hospital where she worked. Peter's mother had been a labour and delivery nurse for 35 years before retiring. She was beloved at the hospital, known for being kind and competent, won awards for her service. When she died of a stroke at 72, Peter was going through her things and found a lockbox hidden in the back of her closet. Inside were hospital bracelets, dozens of them, those little plastic bands they put on newborns to match them with their mothers. Peter thought it was weird, but figured maybe his mum had kept them as mementos. Some nurses get attached to the babies they help deliver. But then Peter found a journal, and reading it made his blood run cold. His mother had been systematically switching babies at birth for over 20 years. She'd written detailed entries about which babies she'd switched, why she'd done it, her reasoning for each swap. Some of it was based on her judgment of which parents deserved which babies. She'd switch a healthy baby from parents she deemed unfit, with a sick baby from parents she thought were more capable. Sometimes she did it based on race. She'd written horrible things about not wanting certain babies going to certain families. Sometimes it seemed completely random, like she'd done it just to see if she could get away with it. The journal documented at least 63 baby swaps over the course of her career. Peter was horrified. He immediately went to the police with the journal and the hospital bracelets. The police launched a massive investigation, trying to match the bracelets and journal entries to hospital records. It was complicated because some of the records were from decades ago. Some had been digitized poorly, some were missing, but they eventually identified 38 confirmed cases where babies had definitely been switched, and suspected another 25 possible cases. The hospital had to contact all these families, now spread across the country, and tell them that they might not be raising their biological children, that their biological children might be living with other families. The fallout was unprecedented. Some families didn't want to know, refused DNA testing, said their family was their family, regardless of biology. Others desperately wanted to find their biological children, Several families did DNA tests and confirmed switches, and then they had to decide what to do with that information. Do you contact the other family? Do you want a relationship with your biological child, who's now an adult stranger? Do you tell your raised child that you're not their biological parent? Some families tried to swap back. These awkward attempts by parents to connect with the biological children they'd never known, while maintaining relationships with the children they'd raised. It worked for some families. They managed to integrate both sets of parents and children into extended blended families. For others, it was a disaster. Children feeling rejected by raised parents who suddenly seemed more interested in biological children, biological parents feeling cheated out of raising their own kids. Several families ended up in court battles over inheritance rights, medical decisions, organ donations, all sorts of legal questions that nobody had clear answers to. Peter was named in several lawsuits, people blaming him for not discovering his mother's crimes sooner, though ultimately those suits were dismissed because he genuinely had no knowledge of what she'd been doing. Peter said he's had to come to terms with the fact that his mother, who he'd loved and respected, was a monster who destroyed dozens of families because of her God complex and prejudices. He's tried to reach out to the affected families to apologise, but most want nothing to do with him. They see him as an extension of his mother. The hospital was sued for millions. They'd failed to have proper protocols to prevent this kind of thing, had blindly trusted a long-time employee. They implemented new security measures, multiple checks and balances, but the damage was done. Peter found out that his mother's motivation, based on her journal entries, seemed to be a mixture of playing God and racism and classism. She genuinely believed she was improving lives by giving babies to parents she deemed more worthy. She'd written things like, "This baby deserves better parents who can provide for her," or "These parents are too young and irresponsible for such a healthy child." The arrogance and cruelty of it was staggering. Peter had to go to therapy to deal with the fact that every kind memory he had of his mother was now tainted by knowing what she'd been doing. He started a support group for families affected by his mother's actions, trying in some small way to make amends for what she'd done, even though he knows he can't undo the damage. One of the most heartbreaking cases was twins who'd been separated. One twin switched at birth, raised in different families, never knowing they had an identical twin until the investigation revealed it. They were 41 years old when they finally met. Some of the families whose babies had been switched with sick babies sued Peter's mother's estate, arguing that they'd been deprived of their healthy children and forced to deal with medical issues that weren't theirs to bear, while other families had received healthy babies they didn't biologically have. The ethical and legal implications were mind-boggling. Let's shift to another devastating story, this one from a woman named Vanessa, and it involves a wedding dress fitting that revealed a family secret that changed everything. Vanessa was getting married and went wedding dress shopping with her mother, her future mother-in-law, and her bridesmaids. They went to this upscale bridal boutique, tried on dozens of dresses, finally found the perfect one. When Vanessa came out in the winning dress, everyone was gushing about how beautiful she looked, and the saleswoman said she looked just like another bride who'd worn that same dress style 28 years ago. And what a coincidence that bride had the same last name. Monroe? Was she a relative? Vanessa's mother went pale and said no, must be a different family, very common name. But the saleswoman kept talking, said she remembered because it had been such a sad situation. The bride had gotten married despite being pregnant with another man's baby. The groom didn't know. She'd overheard them talking in the dressing room. Vanessa's mother tried to shut the conversation down, but the saleswoman, oblivious to the tension, pulled out this old photo album they kept of past brides, found the picture, and showed it to everyone. It was definitely Vanessa's mother, 28 years younger, in a wedding dress. The date written on the photo was exactly 9 months before Vanessa was born. Vanessa's mother had always told her she was born a year after the wedding, that they'd waited to have children, but the math clearly didn't add up. Vanessa asked her mother point blank if she was pregnant at the wedding, And her mother, cornered and humiliated in front of everyone, admitted yes, but said Vanessa's father was Vanessa's biological father. The saleswoman had misheard or misremembered. But Vanessa's future mother-in-law, who'd never particularly liked Vanessa's mother, pushed the issue, said if that's true, then why lie about the timeline? Vanessa's mother broke down right there in the bridal boutique and admitted that Vanessa's father wasn't her biological father. She'd gotten pregnant from an affair, panicked, and quickly gotten engaged to her boyfriend at the time, Vanessa's dad, who she'd been dating for 2 years. He'd believed Vanessa was his. She was born a bit early, but not suspiciously so, and Vanessa's mother had kept the secret for 28 years. Vanessa was standing there in her wedding dress, her perfect day completely destroyed, finding out her entire identity was a lie. She asked who her biological father was, and her mother wouldn't say at first, but, under pressure, finally admitted it was Vanessa's uncle, her father's younger brother. The affair had happened during a rough patch in her relationship with Vanessa's dad. The brother had been staying with them. One thing led to another. It was a mistake. She'd ended it immediately, but then found out she was pregnant. Vanessa felt like she was going to throw up. Her uncle had been at every family gathering her entire life. Holidays, birthdays, graduations, and he'd known the whole time that she was his daughter. Her mother admitted that, yes, the uncle knew. She'd told him shortly after Vanessa was born, and he'd agreed to keep the secret. Vanessa left the bridal boutique without buying the dress, went straight to her father's office and told him everything. He didn't believe her at first, said her mother would never do that. But when Vanessa said they needed to do a DNA test, he agreed. Said if there was even a chance, she wasn't his biological daughter, he needed to know. The DNA test confirmed it. Vanessa was not biologically his. Vanessa's father was absolutely destroyed. His entire life with her mother had been built on a lie. The daughter he'd raised and loved for 28 years wasn't his, and his own brother had betrayed him in the worst possible way. He filed for divorce immediately, cut off his brother completely, and Vanessa was afraid he'd reject her too. But he told her she'd always be his daughter regardless of biology. He'd raised her, and that was what mattered. But their relationship was strained. Every time he looked at Vanessa, he saw the affair, the betrayal, the lie. Vanessa confronted her uncle, who admitted everything, said he'd wanted to tell the truth years ago, but Vanessa's mother had threatened to cut him off from the family if he said anything. He'd watched Vanessa grow up knowing she was his daughter, but unable to have a real relationship with her. He'd married and had his own kids, but he'd always felt guilty about Vanessa. The family completely imploded, sides were taken, people stopped speaking to each other, holidays were cancelled because nobody could be in the same room. Vanessa's wedding was postponed. She couldn't get married while dealing with all this, and her fiancé was incredibly understanding, but Vanessa could tell the drama was wearing on him too. She started having doubts about marriage in general. If her mother could lie for nearly 3 decades, what did that say about love and commitment and trust? Vanessa eventually did marry her fiancé a year later. Small ceremony. None of her mother's side of the family invited. Her biological father walked her down the aisle because her dad, the man who raised her, said he couldn't do it. It was too painful. Vanessa's relationship with her mother never recovered. They're civil but barely speak. Vanessa can't forgive the decades of lies and the fact that her mother destroyed her father's life without remorse. Vanessa also struggled with her relationship with her half-siblings, the uncle's legitimate children, who were technically also her half-siblings, but nobody knew how to navigate that. The whole thing was a mess that started with a chatty saleswoman in a bridal boutique and a photo album nobody thought to hide. Now I've got to tell you about Marcus's story, which involves finding his wife's diary and discovering she'd been documenting her plans to leave him in excruciating detail for over 2 years. Marcus and his wife Jill had been married for 9 years, seemed happy, no major problems, normal married life with its ups and downs. Marcus was cleaning out their home office because they were getting ready to renovate, and he found one of Jill's old journals that had fallen behind a filing cabinet. He figured he'd just give it back to her, wasn't trying to snoop, but it fell open when he picked it up, and he saw his name, so he started reading. The journal was from 2 years ago, and it was filled with entries about how Jill was planning to leave Marcus. But these weren't spontaneous emotional entries about being unhappy. These were calculated, strategic plans. Jill had written out a step-by-step guide for how to leave the marriage while maximising her financial benefit and minimising her losses. She'd documented plans to secretly funnel money into accounts Marcus didn't know about, strategies for making Marcus look bad so she'd have leverage in divorce proceedings, ideas for how to turn their mutual friends against him. Everything. There were entries about fights she was planning to pick on purpose, so she could document Marcus being angry or unreasonable, notes about saving text messages out of context to make him look controlling, reminders to herself to start complaining about him to family members, to build a narrative of an unhappy marriage. The most chilling part was how cold and calculated it all was. There was no emotion, no sadness about the relationship ending, just pure strategy. Jill had written things like, Phase 1 is establishing separate finances without raising suspicion. Phase 2 is building a case for emotional abuse by documenting normal marital disagreements and framing them as patterns of behaviour. Phase 3 is securing support from family and friends by playing the victim. She'd even planned out custody strategies for their 2 kids, though Marcus noted she seemed more concerned with how custody would affect her financially than with the actual well-being of the children. But here's the thing that made it even more confusing. That journal was from 2 years ago, and Jill was still with Marcus, still acting like everything was fine, still sleeping in the same bed and saying I love you and planning their next vacation together. Had she changed her mind about leaving? Was she still planning to leave but waiting for the right time? Or had all of this already been executed and Marcus just didn't realise he was living in a staged version of his marriage? Marcus didn't know what to do. If he confronted Jill about the journal, she'd know he'd read her private thoughts, which even though they were about planning to destroy him, still felt like a violation. If he didn't confront her, he'd be living in constant paranoia, wondering when the other shoe would drop. Marcus decided to do some investigating on his own before confronting Jill. He checked their bank accounts and discovered Jill had indeed opened several accounts he didn't know about, had been slowly transferring small amounts of money, not enough that he'd notice from any single transaction, but adding up to over $40,000 over 2 years. He checked the credit cards and found she'd been paying for a storage unit. He went there and found boxes of his things, important documents, some valuables, things she'd clearly been slowly removing from the house. He talked to some mutual friends casually, asked if Jill had been venting to them about their marriage, and several admitted she'd been telling them about problems Marcus didn't even know existed, painting him as neglectful and emotionally distant. She'd been building her case just like the journal said. Marcus finally confronted Jill, put the journal on the kitchen table and asked her to explain. Jill's first reaction was anger that he'd invaded her privacy, but Marcus pointed out she'd been planning to systematically destroy his life, so maybe his invasion of privacy wasn't the biggest issue. Jill tried to backtrack, said that journal was from a dark time in their marriage. She'd been unhappy, but they'd worked through it. She wasn't planning to leave anymore. But Marcus showed her evidence of the bank accounts, the storage unit, the ongoing manipulation of their friends, all things that had happened recently, not 2 years ago. Jill finally admitted she'd been keeping her options open, said she wasn't sure if she wanted to stay married but wanted to be prepared if she decided to leave, and she didn't see what was wrong with protecting herself financially and socially. Marcus was floored by her logic, said marriage was supposed to be a partnership, not a strategic game where you're constantly preparing for betrayal. He filed for divorce immediately, used Jill's own journal and evidence of her financial deception to get a favourable settlement. The judge was not sympathetic to Jill's arguments that she was just being prudent. Marcus got primary custody of the kids because he was able to prove Jill had been more interested in custody as a financial and social strategy than because she actually wanted to co-parent. The mutual friends who'd been manipulated by Jill felt betrayed when they found out she'd been using them as part of a long con. Most of them sided with Marcus. Jill ended up with less in the divorce than if she'd just been honest and asked for a divorce 2 years ago when she'd first been unhappy. Marcus said the worst part wasn't even the divorce or the financial manipulation. It was the realization that for 2 years, maybe longer, he'd been living with someone who was studying him like an opponent, documenting his every flaw, strategizing about how to hurt him most effectively, all while smiling and acting like they were a team. He didn't know if Jill had ever really loved him or if their entire marriage had been some kind of performance. He's been in therapy trying to process the mindfuck of discovering that the person sleeping next to you every night sees you as an adversary to be defeated rather than a partner. Alright, we're coming up on our final stories and I want to hit you with one more absolutely insane tale. This one about a surprise inheritance that revealed a secret life nobody knew about. This comes from a woman named Rebecca, whose aunt Linda had died at 75, never married, no kids, lived a quiet life as a librarian in a small town. Linda left everything to Rebecca because Rebecca had been the only family member who'd stayed in regular contact with her, visited her, took her to doctor's appointments in her final years. The inheritance was expected to be modest, maybe the small house, and a little bit of savings. But when the lawyer read the will, Rebecca discovered that Linda was leaving her an estate worth over $8 million. Rebecca was in shock. Librarians don't make that kind of money. Where had it all come from? The lawyer explained that Linda had been a successful novelist who'd published under a pen name for 40 years. Nobody in her family had known. Linda had kept her writing career completely separate from her regular life. Under her pen name, Linda had written a series of romance novels that had sold millions of copies, been adapted into movies, spawned a massive franchise. She'd been essentially living a double life, mild-mannered librarian by day, best-selling author by night, and she'd never told anyone in her family. The lawyer gave Rebecca a letter Linda had written, explaining that she'd kept it secret because she wanted to be known for herself, not for her success. She didn't want her relationships with family to change because of money or fame. She'd lived modestly because she didn't need much, saved and invested everything, and was leaving it to Rebecca because Rebecca had loved her for who she was, not what she had. Rebecca was honoured but also overwhelmed. $8 million is life-changing, and with it came decisions about what to do with Linda's literary legacy, whether to reveal the pen name to the family, how to handle the continuing royalties and movie rights. But then other family members found out about the inheritance, people who'd barely spoken to Linda in years. Suddenly, they came out of the woodwork demanding their share. Rebecca's cousins sued, claiming that Linda hadn't been of sound mind when she'd made the will, that Rebecca had manipulated her, that the money should be divided among all the nieces and nephews. The lawsuit was brutal. They dredged up every visit Rebecca had made to Linda, trying to paint them as manipulation, suggested Rebecca had isolated Linda from the family, all sorts of accusations. But Linda had been meticulous. She documented her wishes clearly, had video testimony explaining her reasoning, had letters detailing which family members had abandoned her and why Rebecca deserved the inheritance. The lawsuit was thrown out. Then Rebecca faced another problem. Fans of Linda's novels were desperate to know more about the author who'd passed away. Publishers wanted to release Linda's unpublished works. Movie studios wanted to make biopics. Everyone wanted a piece of Linda's legacy. Rebecca, who'd inherited all the rights and control over Linda's literary estate, had to decide how much of her aunt's private life to share with the world. Linda had left instructions that Rebecca could reveal her identity after death if she chose, but Rebecca struggled with the decision because she knew Linda had valued her privacy fiercely. Rebecca eventually decided to reveal Linda's pen name and identity, but only released limited biographical information, protecting the private details of Linda's life. The revelation that a small-town librarian had been behind one of the most successful romance series of the past 4 decades became international news. Linda's books shot back up the bestseller lists, and Rebecca was suddenly managing a massive literary empire while grieving her aunt and dealing with family members who'd turned on her. The stress was enormous. Rebecca had to hire lawyers, accountants, literary agents, publicists, all while working through her own feelings about inheriting so much money and responsibility. Some of Linda's former colleagues came forward with stories about suspecting Linda was more than she seemed. Little hints and clues they'd noticed over the years, but never pursued, and Rebecca realised Linda had been incredibly skilled at compartmentalising her life. The most touching part was when Rebecca went through Linda's house and found decades of journals where Linda had written about her 2 lives. How she'd loved being a librarian because it was real and grounded, how writing was her escape and passion, and how she'd deliberately chosen to keep them separate so neither would consume her entirely. Linda had written about watching family members from a distance, knowing she could have helped them financially, but choosing not to because she didn't want money to corrupt their relationships. She wanted to know who truly cared about her versus who cared about what she could provide. Rebecca said reading those journals made her understand Linda's choices better, made her respect the incredible discipline it took to maintain that separation for 4 decades, and made her determined to honour Linda's legacy by being thoughtful about how she used the inheritance. Rebecca ended up using a significant portion of the money to start a foundation supporting libraries and literacy programs in Linda's name, which she knew would have made her aunt proud. She also commissioned a documentary about Linda's life that focused on her work as a librarian and her writing career, but kept the most personal details private, as Linda would have wanted. The family members who'd sued never reconciled with Rebecca. They remained bitter about the inheritance, but Rebecca said she's at peace with it because she knows she earned Linda's trust through years of genuine care and love, not through manipulation or expectation of reward. Now let's dive into Thomas's story, which is about a medical emergency that revealed his wife had been slowly poisoning him for 6 months. Thomas had been feeling sick for months. Unexplained symptoms, fatigue, nausea, dizzy spells. Doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong. They'd run tests, but everything came back inconclusive. He'd lost 30 pounds, was missing work. His quality of life was deteriorating rapidly. His wife, Monica, had been so supportive through everything, taking him to appointments, making special meals to help him keep his strength up, researching his symptoms online, being the perfect caregiver. Then one night, Thomas had a particularly severe episode. Couldn't stop vomiting, extreme abdominal pain. Monica called an ambulance and he was rushed to the hospital. At the hospital, the doctors ran more comprehensive tests and found high levels of arsenic in Thomas's blood, consistent with long-term exposure. Thomas's first thought was contamination, maybe something at his job, maybe environmental, but the doctor suggested they test items from his home to find the source. Monica volunteered to bring in everything Thomas regularly consumed: his vitamins, his protein shakes, his coffee, wanting to help identify the problem. But when the police got involved, standard procedure for poisoning cases, they started asking questions about who had access to Thomas's food and drinks, and Monica's behaviour started to seem off. She was too eager to control the narrative, too quick to suggest external sources, too insistent that it couldn't be anything in their home. The police asked to search the house and Monica initially refused, said it was invasive and unnecessary, but Thomas insisted he wanted to find out what was making him sick. In Monica's car, hidden in a gym bag in the trunk, police found a container of arsenic-based rat poison, and in the house, they found traces of it in the special protein powder Monica had been buying for Thomas, the powder she'd insisted on preparing for him herself every morning. Monica was arrested and Thomas was left trying to process that his wife of 7 years had been systematically poisoning him. During the investigation, it came out that Monica had taken out a life insurance policy on Thomas 2 years earlier, $2 million, with herself as the sole beneficiary. She'd been patient, had started with small amounts to make Thomas sick slowly, make it look like a wasting disease. Nothing that would raise immediate red flags. If Thomas had died, it would have looked like he'd succumbed to an undiagnosed illness. Monica would have been the grieving widow, and she would have collected $2 million. The premeditation was chilling. Monica had researched arsenic poisoning extensively, had browsed forums about undetectable poisons, had calculated doses to make Thomas sick enough to die eventually, but not so sick that doctors would immediately suspect poisoning. Thomas testified at her trial, said the worst part wasn't even the physical suffering, though that had been terrible. It was the psychological betrayal of realizing that every morning when Monica had handed him his protein shakes with a smile and a kiss, she'd been giving him poison, that every concerned look and gentle touch had been an act, that she'd been watching him deteriorate and had probably been excited that her plan was working. Monica showed no remorse during the trial. Her defense tried to argue that Thomas had been poisoning himself and framing her, but the evidence was overwhelming. Her internet search history, her purchase of the poison, her fingerprints on the container, the insurance policy, everything pointed to her guilt. She was convicted of attempted murder and insurance fraud, sentenced to 25 years. Thomas had to go through months of medical treatment to recover from the arsenic poisoning. Some of the damage was permanent. He has ongoing issues with his liver and kidneys. He's terrified of dating again, paranoid about food and drinks when he's with other people, has to fight the urge to watch people prepare anything he consumes. He said he still has nightmares about Monica smiling at him while handing him his morning shake. That image of her cheerful face while actively trying to kill him haunts him. The life insurance company obviously didn't pay out and sued Monica for fraud. Thomas has had to deal with the financial aftermath of months of medical bills from trying to diagnose an illness that was intentionally inflicted. Some of their mutual friends didn't believe Monica was guilty at first, thought maybe it was a mistake or misunderstanding. But when the evidence came out in trial, when they heard about the searches for how much arsenic is lethal and how to make poisoning look like natural illness, they couldn't deny it anymore. Thomas said he goes over their relationship in his head constantly, trying to figure out when Monica decided to kill him, if she'd ever loved him at all, or if he'd been a mark from the beginning, whether the insurance policy was always the plan, or if something had changed 2 years ago that made her want him dead. He'll never know, because Monica has never given a real explanation. Her defense was denial, and her silence afterward has been absolute. Thomas has become an advocate for awareness about domestic violence and homicide, speaks about how it's not always obvious, how abusers can be charming and caring on the surface, while plotting murder, how important it is to pay attention to patterns and trust your instincts. He wishes he'd questioned why he only felt sick at home, why his symptoms seemed to improve when he travelled for work. Little clues that, in hindsight, seem obvious, but at the time he'd attributed to stress or environment. Now here's a story from Claire that involves a gender reveal party that revealed much more than anyone expected. Claire and her husband Jake were pregnant with their 3rd child. They already had 2 boys and were hoping for a girl. Decided to throw a big gender reveal party to celebrate with family and friends. They'd kept the gender a secret from everyone, including themselves. Had the ultrasound tech put the results in an envelope that they gave to a baker to make a reveal cake. Standard procedure. The party was huge, both families, all their friends, probably 70 people in their backyard. Kids running around, everyone excited. The moment came to cut the cake. Claire and Jake cut into it together, and the inside was pink. It's a girl, everyone cheered and congratulated them. But Jake wasn't celebrating. He was staring at the cake with this weird expression, and then he looked at Claire and said, "We need to talk inside, right now." Claire was confused, thought maybe he was disappointed it wasn't another boy, followed him inside. Jake closed the door and said there's no way that baby is mine. Claire was shocked, asked what he was talking about, and Jake explained that he'd had a vasectomy 6 months ago, hadn't told Claire because he didn't want to fight about it. They'd been arguing about whether to have more kids, and he'd made the decision unilaterally. But now Claire was pregnant, which meant either the vasectomy had failed, which was possible but unlikely, or Claire had cheated, which is where Jake's mind immediately went. Claire was furious that he'd had a vasectomy without discussing it with her. That was a major decision about their family that he'd made secretly. But she was also panicking because she hadn't cheated. The baby was definitely conceived during their marriage. So how was this possible? They ended up having a massive fight right there in the kitchen, while 70 people waited outside, wondering what was going on. Claire insisted she hadn't cheated. Jake said the vasectomy had been 6 months ago. The baby was clearly conceived after that, based on the due date. The math didn't work. Claire's sister eventually came inside to check on them, overheard enough to understand what was happening, and asked Jake if he'd actually had the follow-up test to confirm the vasectomy had worked. Jake admitted he hadn't. The doctor had told him to come back for testing, but he'd been too busy and figured it was fine. Claire and her sister immediately jumped on this, said vasectomies can fail, sperm can persist for months afterward. Jake needed to get tested before making accusations. Jake agreed to get tested, and sure enough, the vasectomy had failed, his sperm count was still viable, the procedure hadn't been successful. Claire was vindicated, but absolutely furious with Jake. Not only had he made a huge decision about their reproductive future without her consent, but then he'd publicly humiliated her by accusing her of cheating at their own gender reveal party. Everyone at the party had noticed something was wrong. People had started leaving when Claire and Jake didn't come back outside. The ones who stayed were gossiping about what could have happened. Claire and Jake eventually came back out, tried to play it off like everything was fine, but the damage was done. Family members were asking questions, friends were texting to ask if they were okay. The whole thing was a disaster. The gender reveal party that was supposed to be a joyous celebration became infamous in their friend group as the party where Jake accused Claire of infidelity in front of everyone. Claire seriously considered divorce, felt like the vasectomy without her consent was a violation of their marriage. That Jake's immediate jump to accusing her of cheating showed he didn't trust her, that their foundation was broken. They went to marriage counselling. Jake apologised repeatedly, admitted he'd been wrong on multiple fronts, but Claire said the trust was shattered. They're still together, but Claire said their marriage has never been the same. She can't forget that Jake was willing to believe she'd cheated, rather than consider his medical procedure had failed, that he cared more about controlling their family size than about her input. The baby girl was born healthy. Jake loves her, but Claire said every time she looks at their daughter, she remembers that gender reveal party and the humiliation and hurt. Some family members still don't know the full story, just know that something weird happened at the party, and Claire prefers to keep it that way, rather than rehash the whole thing. Jake did have another vasectomy, this one successful, and with follow-up testing, but it was done with Claire's knowledge and consent this time. Claire said she wishes they'd never done a gender reveal party, wishes they'd just found out the gender privately and avoided the whole disaster, but at least it brought the vasectomy issue to light before it was too late to address it. Now let's talk about Ethan's story, which involves a DNA test that revealed his entire family had been lying to him about who his mother was for 33 years. Ethan had grown up believing his mother had died in a car accident when he was 2 years old. That's what his father and grandparents had always told him, and he had vague memories that he thought were of her but might have just been created from looking at photos. His father had remarried when Ethan was 5 to a woman named Patricia, who Ethan had always called Mom. She'd raised him and he loved her, but he'd always felt a connection to his biological mother's memory. When Ethan turned 33, he decided to do a DNA test out of curiosity about his ancestry, and he matched with a woman who showed up as his mother. Not possible since his mother was dead, but the match was undeniable. 50% DNA match, definitely parent-child relationship. Ethan reached out to this woman. Her name was Carol, and she responded immediately, said she'd been hoping he'd find her someday, that she'd never stopped thinking about him. Carol told Ethan a completely different story than what he'd been told his whole life. She said she hadn't died in a car accident. She'd been very young when she had Ethan, only 17, and she'd been in an abusive relationship with Ethan's father. When Ethan was 2, she'd tried to leave and take Ethan with her, but Ethan's father and his family had essentially kidnapped Ethan, told Carol that if she tried to get him back, they'd make sure she never saw him again, that they had money and lawyers and would destroy her. Carol had been a scared teenager with no resources, no family support. She'd tried to fight for custody, but Ethan's father's family had connections, money, and they'd painted Carol as an unfit mother, a drug addict, mentally unstable. None of it true, but she couldn't afford lawyers to fight back. Eventually, she'd been forced to sign away her parental rights under duress, and Ethan's father had told Ethan she was dead to make sure he never went looking for her. Carol had spent 31 years watching Ethan grow up from a distance. Social media had made it easier in recent years. She'd seen his graduations, his wedding, the birth of his children, all from afar, unable to be part of his life. Ethan was completely shattered. Everything he'd been told about his origins was a lie. His father had essentially erased his mother from existence and replaced her with Patricia. When Ethan confronted his father, his dad tried to justify it, said Carol had been a bad influence, that Ethan was better off without her, that they'd done what was best for him. But Ethan had talked to Carol extensively by this point, had heard her side, had seen documents she'd kept from the custody battle, and he knew his father was lying. Ethan's relationship with his father completely fell apart. He felt betrayed on every level. His father had stolen his mother from him and had lied to him for over 3 decades. Patricia, his stepmother, admitted she'd known the truth the whole time, had gone along with the lie, and Ethan felt betrayed by her too. The woman he'd called Mom had been complicit in erasing his real mother. Ethan started building a relationship with Carol, and it was beautiful, but also painful. They'd missed 31 years together. She'd missed his entire childhood, all his milestones, everything. Carol had never remarried, never had other children, said she couldn't move on when her son was out there somewhere. Ethan introduced Carol to his wife and children, her grandchildren she'd never met, and Carol was overwhelmed with emotion. Ethan's children now have a grandmother they never knew existed. His wife has been supportive, but it's been an adjustment for everyone. Ethan's father and Patricia have been completely cut out of his life. He said he can never forgive the level of deception and manipulation, that they essentially committed a crime by taking him from Carol and then covering it up with lies for decades. Some extended family members have tried to defend Ethan's father, saying he was just trying to protect Ethan from an unstable situation. But when Ethan shows them the evidence, the court documents, Carol's side of the story, most of them realise that Ethan's father was the abusive one, not Carol. Carol has said she doesn't want Ethan to hate his father on her behalf, that she just wants the chance to know her son. But Ethan said the hate isn't on her behalf. It's his own anger at being lied to his entire life, at being denied a relationship with his mother because of his father's control and cruelty. Ethan said the hardest part is going through his memories and realising so many moments were based on lies. Every time someone mentioned his mother's death, every Mother's Day, when he'd visit a grave that didn't even have her body in it because she wasn't dead, every story his father told about what his mother was like. All fabrications designed to keep Ethan from ever looking for the truth. Carol and Ethan are making up for lost time. They talk every day, visit as often as possible, and Carol has said that having Ethan back in her life has healed a wound that had been bleeding for 31 years, but they both acknowledge that what was stolen from them can never fully be recovered. All right, we're getting close to the end here, but I want to leave you with a few more stories that will absolutely blow your mind. Starting with Derek's tale about a business partnership that turned out to be a decades-long con. Derek and his best friend since childhood, Aaron, had always dreamed of starting a business together. And in their late 20s, they finally did it. A tech startup that took off beyond their wildest expectations. Within 10 years, they'd built a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars. They were both wealthy beyond anything they'd imagined growing up. Derek handled the creative and product side. Aaron handled the business and finances. It was a perfect partnership based on decades of trust and friendship. Then one day, federal agents showed up at Derek's house with a warrant for Aaron's arrest, and Derek's world imploded. Turned out Aaron had been embezzling from the company for years, had created an elaborate system of shell companies and false invoices to siphon off money, had stolen over $40 million. But it was worse than that. The investigation revealed that Aaron had been planning this from the beginning. The entire friendship, the entire business partnership, had been a long con. Aaron hadn't actually grown up in the neighborhood like he'd claimed. He'd moved there specifically because he'd identified Derek as a mark, a smart kid from a wealthy family who'd likely be successful and trusting. Aaron had manufactured their friendship, had pretended to share interests and values, had studied Derek for years to learn how to manipulate him, all so that eventually he could partner with Derek in business and steal from him. Everything Derek thought he knew about his best friend was a lie. Aaron's backstory, his personality, his values, his loyalty, all of it had been carefully constructed to gain Derek's trust. The federal investigation uncovered that Aaron had done this before, had befriended other successful people, ingratiated himself into their lives, and stolen from them. He was essentially a career con artist who played very long games. Derek had to testify against Aaron, watch evidence presented that showed just how calculated and cold the whole thing had been. Aaron had kept notes on Derek's psychology, his weaknesses, his blind spots, had strategized about how to maintain the friendship and the con for decades. Aaron was convicted and sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, but the money was mostly gone, spent or hidden in offshore accounts that couldn't be recovered. Derek not only lost $40 million, he lost his best friend, or rather, he lost the illusion of a best friend. Lost decades of memories that he now knew were fake, lost his ability to trust anyone. Derek went through severe depression, questioning every relationship in his life, wondering if anyone was really who they seemed to be, paranoid that he'd been fooled before and could be fooled again. He ended up selling his stake in the company, couldn't bear to run it without Aaron, even though the Aaron he'd thought he knew had never really existed. Derek's been in therapy for years, trying to process the mindfuck of learning that one of the most important relationships in his life, spanning over 25 years, had been entirely fabricated by a sociopath. He said the worst part is that he still has fond memories of their friendship, moments that felt real and meaningful, and he doesn't know how to reconcile those feelings with the knowledge that Aaron was faking everything the entire time. Was Aaron ever genuinely happy at Derek's wedding, or was he calculating how the marriage might affect their business partnership? When they'd stayed up all night, talking about their dreams and fears, had Aaron been taking notes for future manipulation? Derek will never know, because Aaron has never shown any remorse or given any real explanation beyond what was necessary for his legal defense. Some people have told Derek he should feel lucky that he found out when he did, that Aaron could have stolen much more, or caused even worse damage, but Derek said it doesn't feel lucky. It feels like his entire adult life was built on a foundation of lies. The tech industry where Derek works has rallied around him. Other founders have shared their own stories of being conned or betrayed, but Derek said, knowing he's not alone doesn't really help. He's still the one who has to live with the knowledge that his best friend was never his friend at all. Our penultimate story comes from a woman named Helen, and it's about a hospital mix-up that revealed a 30-year secret nobody was supposed to ever know about. Helen needed a kidney transplant. She was in kidney failure and, on dialysis, time was running out. Her siblings all got tested to see if they were matches, but none of them were, which was disappointing but not surprising. Sibling matches aren't guaranteed. Then Helen's doctor suggested testing her parents. Sometimes parents can be good matches even if siblings aren't. Helen's mother got tested and wasn't a match, but her father refused, said he had a medical condition that would preclude him from donating, and there was no point in testing. Helen was disappointed but accepted it, figured she'd wait on the donor list. But Helen's younger brother Tom was suspicious of their father's excuse, did some research, and the condition their father claimed to have wouldn't actually prevent him from being tested or donating. So why was he lying? Tom confronted their father privately, pushed him on it, and their father finally broke down and admitted he wasn't Helen's biological father. So there was no point in him getting tested because he couldn't possibly be a match. Tom was shocked, demanded to know the full story, and their father explained that Helen's mother had an affair 32 years ago, got pregnant, and he'd agreed to raise Helen as his own. They'd kept it secret all these years. Helen had no idea. Tom was faced with an impossible choice: tell Helen the truth so she could find her biological father and see if he was a match, potentially saving her life, but destroying her sense of identity and her relationship with their parents, or keep the secret and let Helen potentially die waiting for a donor. Tom talked to his mother, begged her to tell Helen the truth, but their mother refused, said it would destroy their family, that Helen didn't need to know. But Helen was dying. She had maybe a year left without a transplant. Tom couldn't let her die to protect a secret. Tom told Helen everything, brought her documentation their parents had hidden, medical records from the time of her birth that showed questions about paternity. Helen was devastated, but also desperate. She wanted to live, and if finding her biological father meant a chance at a kidney, she had to try. Helen confronted her parents. Her mother finally admitted the affair and gave Helen her biological father's name, a man named Richard, who'd been a co-worker of her mother's. The affair had been brief. Richard had never known Helen existed. Helen tracked down Richard, who was shocked to learn he had a daughter, but he immediately agreed to get tested. Turned out he was a match. Richard donated his kidney to Helen, saving her life, but the emotional fallout was catastrophic. Helen's relationship with her parents was destroyed, especially with her father, who'd raised her, who'd lied to her face and would have let her die rather than reveal the truth. Helen's siblings were divided. Some thought Tom had done the right thing by telling Helen, others thought he should have respected their parents' wishes. The family was fractured. Helen survived the transplant and recovered well physically, but emotionally, she's been a wreck. She's alive because of a biological father she never knew existed, while the man she'd called Dad her whole life had been willing to let her die to keep a secret. She's tried to build a relationship with Richard, who's been kind and welcoming, but it's awkward and strange. They're strangers connected by biology and a life-saving organ. Helen said she's grateful to be alive, but wishes the truth had come out any other way. Wishes her parents had been honest from the beginning. Wishes she hadn't had to nearly die to learn who she really was. Her father, the man who raised her, has tried to apologize and reconcile. Says he was scared and made a terrible choice, but Helen can't forgive him. Can't get past the fact that he valued his pride and secret-keeping over her life. Helen's mother has been mostly silent, unable to face what her decades-old affair and subsequent lies nearly cost her daughter. The whole family's in therapy, trying to process and heal, but Helen said some wounds are too deep, some betrayals too fundamental, and she doesn't know if they'll ever be able to function as a family again. Richard, the biological father, has said he wishes he'd known about Helen from the beginning, that he missed her entire life, but he's grateful he could save her and hopes they can build some kind of relationship moving forward. Helen's caught between two fathers, One who raised her but betrayed her. One who saved her but is essentially a stranger. And she doesn't know how to navigate that. Doesn't know where she belongs or who her family really is. And finally, our last story is from a man named Jason, and it involves a storage unit auction that revealed a murder nobody knew had happened. Jason's hobby was buying abandoned storage units at auction. Sometimes you find valuable stuff. Usually it's junk, but it's like treasure hunting, and he enjoyed it. He won an auction for a unit that had been abandoned for 15 years, hadn't been opened in all that time. Previous owner had stopped paying and never reclaimed it. Jason opened the unit and started sorting through boxes, mostly old clothes and books, nothing valuable. But then he found a locked chest that looked interesting. He broke the lock and inside found journals, photos, and a confession letter. The letter was from a woman named Susan, confessing to murdering her husband in 1995 and hiding his body. The letter was dated 2000, written 5 years after the murder, and it described in detail how she'd poisoned him, buried him in their backyard, reported him missing, and collected his life insurance. Susan's letter said she was writing it down as a confessional, that the guilt was eating her alive, but she was too afraid to go to the police. The journals corroborated everything, detailed entries about her unhappy marriage, her decision to kill her husband, the planning, the execution, the aftermath, all documented in her handwriting. Jason immediately called the police, turned over everything he'd found, and they launched an investigation. They tracked down Susan, who was now in her 70s, still alive and living in a different state. The missing husband case had gone cold decades ago. There had never been any leads. When police confronted Susan with the evidence, she confessed, said she'd hidden those documents in the storage unit, intending to retrieve them someday and destroy them. But she'd moved out of state after the murder, started a new life, and eventually forgotten about the storage unit, stopped paying for it, assumed the contents had been destroyed. Susan's husband's body was found exactly where her letter said it would be, buried in the backyard of their old house, which had since been sold to another family who'd been living on top of a corpse for decades. Susan was arrested and charged with murder, even though it had been 30 years ago. There's no statute of limitations on murder. The husband's family finally got closure. They'd spent 30 years wondering what happened to him. Some had suspected Susan, but could never prove anything. Susan's children, who'd grown up believing their father had abandoned them, learned that their mother had killed him, that they'd been lied to their entire lives. Jason, the storage unit buyer, became a key witness in a murder trial. Never expected that when he bid on that unit. He said it's the craziest thing that's ever happened to him, that he went from treasure hunting to solving a 30-year-old murder. Susan was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, despite her age and her lawyer's arguments that she was no longer a threat to society. The judge said the premeditation and the decades of lies warranted the maximum sentence. Jason said he still buys storage units, but he's a lot more careful about going through them now, afraid of what else he might find. And that wraps up our deep dive into the most explosive family secrets and Reddit confessions that destroyed lives and relationships. These stories show us that sometimes the truth really doesn't set you free. Sometimes it absolutely wrecks everything you thought you knew. From DNA tests revealing decades of lies, to surprise parties that exposed infidelity, to storage units containing murder confessions. These tales prove that reality can be stranger and darker than any fiction. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the wildest stories the internet has to offer. And remember, sometimes the people closest to you are hiding secrets that would change everything if they ever came to light. Stay safe out there, trust your instincts, and I'll see you in the next video. Alright, let's keep going because there are so many more stories that need to be told. Stories that will make you question everything you think you know about the people in your life. This next one comes from a guy named Vincent, and Vincent thought he had the perfect marriage until his wife's dying confession revealed a truth so dark it haunted him for years afterward. Vincent and his wife, Marie, had been married for 43 years, raised 4 children together, built a life full of memories and shared experiences. They were that couple everyone looked up to as relationship goals. When Marie was diagnosed with terminal cancer, Vincent was devastated, but determined to make her final months as comfortable as possible. He took early retirement to care for her, spent every moment by her side, held her hand through the worst of it. In her final week, Marie was in and out of consciousness, on heavy pain medication, and during one of her lucid moments, she told Vincent she needed to confess something, that she couldn't die with this secret. Vincent assumed it would be something small. Maybe she'd spent money she shouldn't have, or told a white lie about something inconsequential. He told her nothing mattered, that he loved her and everything was forgiven. But Marie said no. This was big. This would change everything. And she told him that their oldest son, Michael, wasn't Vincent's biological child. Vincent felt like he'd been punched in the gut. Michael was 41 years old, had Vincent's last name, had grown up calling him Dad. How could he not be Vincent's son? Marie explained that early in their marriage, during a time when Vincent had been travelling a lot for work, she'd had a brief affair with Vincent's boss, a man named Richard, who'd been Vincent's mentor and friend. She'd gotten pregnant, wasn't sure who the father was, but when Michael was born, he looked enough like Vincent that she'd convinced herself he was Vincent's and had buried the truth. But years later, when Michael needed a blood transfusion after a car accident, the hospital had informed Marie privately that based on blood types, Vincent couldn't be Michael's biological father, and that's when Marie knew for certain that Richard was Michael's father. She'd kept the secret for over 40 years, watching Vincent bond with and raise a son who wasn't his, watching Richard interact with Michael at company events and family gatherings, knowing the truth but never saying anything. Vincent was shattered. He asked Marie why she was telling him this now, why she couldn't have just taken it to her grave and let him live in peace, and Marie said she needed to be forgiven, needed to die with a clear conscience, that the guilt had been eating her alive for decades. Vincent said he forgave her, because what else could he say to his dying wife? But inside he was screaming. His entire life felt like a lie. The son he'd raised and loved wasn't his. His best friend and mentor had betrayed him. His wife had lied to him for over 4 decades. Marie died 3 days later, and Vincent was left with this terrible knowledge and an impossible decision about what to do with it. Should he tell Michael the truth, destroy his son's sense of identity and their relationship? Should he confront Richard, who was now in his 80s and had his own family? Should he tell his other 3 children that their oldest brother was actually their half-brother? Vincent decided to get a DNA test done secretly, hoping maybe Marie had been wrong, maybe the hospital had made a mistake all those years ago, but the test confirmed it. Michael was not Vincent's biological son. Vincent spiraled into depression, stopped going to family gatherings, pulled away from Michael without explanation, and Michael was hurt and confused. His father had just lost his wife, and now was pushing away his son when they should have been supporting each other through grief. Vincent's other children noticed something was wrong, staged an intervention, asked Vincent what was going on, and in a moment of weakness and pain, Vincent told them everything. The family exploded. Vincent's daughter Sarah immediately wanted to tell Michael, said he deserved to know the truth, but Vincent's son Tom argued that it would destroy Michael for no good reason, that Vincent was Michael's father in every way that mattered. Vincent's youngest daughter Lisa was angry at Marie, felt betrayed by her mother's decades of lies, said she didn't know if she could forgive her, even though she was dead. The siblings fought bitterly about what to do, and eventually Sarah went behind everyone's back and told Michael everything, said she couldn't keep lying to her brother. Michael was absolutely devastated, confronted Vincent demanding to know if it was true. and Vincent had to admit it was.